This week on Dialogue, Pakistan's most dangerous place. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guests. Ambassador Akbar Ahmed is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University. He was Pakistan's High Commissioner to the UK and Ireland and is the author of more than a dozen award-winning books, including this one, Resistance and Control in Pakistan, which focuses on Waziristan, one of the places we're going to be talking about today. The BBC has referred to him as the world's leading authority on contemporary Islam. Michael Kugelman is Program Associate with the Wilson Center's Asia Program. He's written for publications such as Foreign Policy, World Politics Review, and The Times of India. And he's a regular contributor to The Dawn, one of Pakistan's major English-language newspapers. He recently co-edited the paper, Reaping the Dividend, Overcoming Pakistan's Demographic Challenges. Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Akbar, I would like to begin, if you would, in helping us through a bit of a history lesson. Let's start with a geography lesson. Where are the tribal regions?
The tribal areas of Pakistan, John, is this area between Afghanistan and Pakistan, traditionally between British India and Afghanistan. So this was a crucial, if you like, buffer zone between almost the Central Asian regions and what was then British India. So the British created a special administrative area called the tribal areas, and they had political agents representing central government administering these areas. They constitute some of the most famous tribes among the Pakhtun and some of the fiercest. And the focus, of course, is in Waziristan. Of all the agencies, there were 5 and now 7 agencies. Waziristan was considered the most important because this is the most intractable region because of the terrain and the tribes. The fiercest tribes, the Wazir and the Masood, live in Waziristan. And it's no coincidence that the drone strikes, the Haqqani group, the military action in Pakistan is all focused in Waziristan.
And you were one of those political agents.
I was in charge of Waziristan, South Waziristan, for several years, and of course I was there when it was the cusp of history. The Soviets had just come into Afghanistan, and I was seeing changes beginning to take place, which in time would change the tribal areas beyond recognition, because 3 decades later from the time the Soviets came, you're seeing a very different tribal society in the tribal areas.
So this semi-autonomous deal is essentially residuals of the British Empire.
It is and it isn't, because when Pakistan was created in 1947, the government of Pakistan had peace treaties, agreements with the tribes that they would preserve their own autonomy and that they would give them laws according to their own customs and traditions.
Now, Michael, on the demographics of this, do you know what percentage of the population lives here? I think it's only about 5% of the landmass.
It's a relatively modest percentage of the total. Yeah.
But still, it receives disproportionate attention. Why is that? What makes this area so unique?
Well, I mean, from a U.S. perspective and from a U.S. national security perspective, Waziristan and the broader tribal regions are essentially ground zero in terms of militancy and the like in that region, and arguably for the world. And so therefore, Washington has been focusing for years on getting Pakistan to do more to crack down on militancy than it has. This, of course, is not to say that the Pakistani military has not been cracking down on militancy. It has, only there are certain areas that it is not for strategic reasons that have caused a lot of tensions between Washington and Islamabad. But Waziristan, North Waziristan being a particular problem in that regard.
This whole notion of governance or a governable region, we talk about it often from a Western perspective. Is this a region of the country, the world, that is governable at a level that would satisfy people in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in the U.S.?
John, it's crucial that Washington understands that society. I was there, I spent several years there. My PhD is based in that area. I then went on to be commissioner in Balochistan, another very important part of Pakistan. In fact, that's also considered now a very volatile place, and that's another focus that we should be looking at in terms of the political tensions in the region. Waziristan and the tribal areas had a very traditional society which more or less remained stable. There would be the odd tribal conflict. You'd had at times when the tribals erupted into the settled areas, the army chasing them back. But by and large, there was stability and there was continuity because of three pillars of society. Traditional tribal society based in the tribal charter, the genealogical charter, the religious figures, the clerics running the mosques, and political authority in the political agent representing central government. And this balance between these three pillars maintained stability over a century. It is only now when all three pillars have been demolished, the political agent barely exists. Tribal leadership has been assassinated. In Waziristan alone, Michael, as you know, something like 400 tribal leaders, elders from my time, have been killed, targeted by the TTP, the new force that's emerged there. In the vacuum, that is what has come out of the chaos as a result of the implosion of tribal society. So when Americans say do more, they have no idea what they're saying, because the central government in Pakistan does more by sending in the army. And when the army comes in, 100,000 people came in and then went out and then came in again, and even now we have large numbers of troops. The army has no idea what tribal structure is and how to deal with it. So they make things even worse. So the result is, John, that for the average tribesman, life has become, as one of them said, and I'm in touch with them because of my old contacts, every day for us is 9/11. You're sitting there for the funeral or for a wedding procession, a drone strike will get you, or some militant will walk and blow himself up. The Pakistan army could come and start shelling you, or there may be tribal conflict. So masses of these people in the tribal areas, for the first time in history, have actually left the tribal areas. Waziristan, as you know, you mentioned north, they're living in Bannu or Deir Ismail Khan or in Peshawar as refugees, destitute refugees. So the government of Pakistan has to take the situation there very seriously, because this will be a hotbed of anger, rebellion, violence for an entire generation unless we start taking these people as ordinary human beings and respecting them and showing them the kind of dignity that all human beings deserve.
What is the infrastructure like? We know that the topography is mountainous, arid, but what are the circumstances that people are living in within this region?
Well, I mean, heavily impoverished would be an understatement, I assume. Heavily impoverished, and just dealing with the psychological terror of fearing, something coming from the sky, whether it be a drone or, military force from the ground. I mean, I've spoken with people who've been in the region, in the tribal region, who talk about just hearing the sound of a incoming drone, or what they think is an incoming drone, and just the sound, not even the drone itself, but the sound of it causes children to have nightmares for days and weeks and all. And it's that human element that I think here in Washington, far away, it's relatively underappreciated.
In supplying basics like electricity or water, what is the relationship between the central government and the tribal leadership?
John, the central government has slowly begun to provide this, had begun to provide this from the 60s, 70s onwards. It was very slow, and there are many, many areas that needed to be corrected in terms of a modern state as far as Pakistan was concerned. Electricity, road, transport, access to markets, education, huge areas still to develop. But instead of development, we saw the tribal areas slowly being sucked into the situation in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Many tribesmen crossed over to join the Mujahideen against the Soviets, backed by the Americans and the Pakistanis. And then in the 1990s, you had the Taliban, and then their influence in the tribal areas. Remember, they're both Pashtun tribes. In my agency, for example, called Waziristan, after the Wazir tribe. It's recognized as an agency which is the territory of the Wazir tribe. Half of them lived in Afghanistan, half on the Pakistan side. And for them, there's no border. Your brother's living across that mountain range. If there's a wedding or a function, you just walk across. Now, suddenly there's an international border. In my time, it didn't even exist. I was probably the first political agent to actually visit that area. Today, you have all kinds of military installations and satellite photos, watching movement, etc. And people, as Michael said, terrorized. And we have to inject the human element in discussing these people, because very often the think tanks, and I congratulate you, John, at the Woodrow Wilson Center for including this human element, they are really terrorized, especially the young. Think of the women there, living in this rather segregated way of theirs traditionally, and now being exposed to this migrations, violence from the sky, from your own people, the army, or the tribal conflicts, or the new militants who are targeting elders or anyone they think may be pro-government. It is a very, very dire situation, a society in turmoil. And any administrator will tell you, John, that you need stability, you need a restoration to begin to, like Humpty Dumpty, put the pieces together again. The last thing you need is to continue to hammer that society.
Yeah, about that human element, you've had first-hand experience in dealing with tribal leaders, negotiating. Give us more insight into who these people are on that level. Are they reasonable negotiators? Are they willing to deal with modernity? What are the issues that come up in those types of negotiations?
John, the institution of the political agent was probably one of the most brilliant administrative moves of the British in the 19th century. They had tried war. Remember the first Afghan war, the second Afghan war, and that had failed. Force had failed. It took them a century to realize this. But then they created the political agent. This is the cream of the cream in terms of the British services. They would select the officer, handpick, give them enormous authority. And the British political agent was described as part governor, half ambassador. So the authority to negotiate that you're talking about, he had that. He could in fact negotiate, and for example, in one of my cases, so we had that it continued in Pakistan. A very difficult customer, very difficult, Masood, which meant that, this is the toughest of the tribes. I was having a lot of problems. My predecessor had problems, and he just disappeared into the mountains. So I had two choices: blowing up his villages like the traditional authorities did, arresting people, or then talking to him. And I
Did he respect your authority?
He was not happy with the government of Pakistan, and he was rejecting it. But I called him over and talked to him in terms of honor, and in the traditional concept of Pukhtunwali, the code of the Pathans. And I said, I will honor you, and you must honor your own ideal type code and show me proper behavior, because this is not the behavior of an honorable man. You're outside the law. And think of your son. And I mentioned his son, and he was taken aback. He said, how do you know my son? I said, I'm worried about him. I would like to educate him, send him to a good school. He said, how would that be possible? I said, I'll get him admission into the best school in Lahore. And John, I had no problem with him after that. After that, when I needed someone who had committed a terrible crime and taken refuge in Afghanistan, I needed him brought back. I sent this man with a jirga, a council, to get him back. So it can be done within this system. But if the system is broken, how are you going to deal with these problems? Except through this crude use of force or bribery, and neither are working.
Michael, I have a sense of a complete mismatch or disconnect between the traditional cultures that Akbar is describing and U.S. policymakers. Are we even at the beginning of having a deep enough understanding to negotiate or to deal effectively in these areas?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the first question is, who do we negotiate with? And the interests are so divergent on the two sides in terms of what the U.S. wants in the tribal areas and what Pakistan wants. There are convergences in terms of rooting out the likes of the TTP and the Pakistani Taliban. But, with some of the key power players, particularly in the context of the war in Afghanistan, you have the Haqqani network, which the United States and Pakistan do not see eye to eye on at all in terms of what to do about it. So no, in terms of negotiations, particularly given the general state of the bilateral relationship, it's very messy.
And speaking of these sort of murky borders or border regions, there's no resolution of Afghanistan without resolution of Pakistan. These are joined at the hip.
Absolutely, John. Right. Absolutely joined at the hip. And I am very worried because I'm looking at the whole region in terms of a new project I'm working on, looking at the relationship between the center and the periphery. And American drawdown has begun. So over the next couple of years or two, American troops will start leaving in earnest. What are they leaving behind? That entire region. And a region in turmoil, weak governments, seen by their own people as corrupt and incompetent. Major players in the region very interested in fishing in troubled waters. You have China, you have India, you have Russia, Iran, all the major players in that region. And what have we left behind? Are there any structures that can absorb the change or implement progressive change, bring in schools, education, roads, and a modicum of prosperity and stability to the people, which is what people want there. They want to get on with their lives.
You earlier this week spoke at the State Department, invitation to provide a briefing. What did you tell them? What is the briefing? What direction did you try to give the Department of
I
State?
was encouraged, John, by the very fact that they invited me to talk to them about this, and I talked as a whole.
Encouraged because of their focus on...
Because even calling me, because, you know, I do tend to talk bluntly. I've been there, I know the area, and I have sympathy. And I have sympathy for the American position, because I do believe that America has an ideal which it needs to promote in terms of its ideas of freedom and democracy and human rights and civil liberties. These are huge and great values which are appreciated right across the world. And this is where we must stand. Now, the response I got was very, very encouraging, and in fact, they want an ongoing series of discussions on this topic. So that encouraged me. There was a more, you see, the approach I had was more historic and cultural than a bureaucracy or a diplomat can afford, because they're dealing with day-to-day issues. And of course, they're acutely aware of this, that they have to respond to what's happening on the ground. But the very fact that they were prepared to step back, as it were, in history and look at it from that perspective certainly encouraged me. I will say that it's coming a little bit late. We are really talking of a decade after events, but it's faster than what the British did. I think it took a century for the British to be aware that we need to...
Based on the British clock, we're ahead of schedule.
You're doing fast, yes, we're working fast.
Are they asking the right questions?
I think now they are. Right now they are, because right now there is the sense, as Michael said, what do we do about it? Here you've got this huge problem. We have these very disparate positions on the same situation. How do we deal with this? So the first question, of course, is to begin to understand this. It's not a question of Washington versus Islamabad or Kabul. It's also a question of how tribal leaders are planning their strategies in the tribal areas of Pakistan, in Balochistan, because don't underestimate the wisdom and the shrewdness of these tribal people. They've also been playing their own version of the great game for centuries now. You know, they've been dealing with superpowers in the 19th century. You had Imperial Russia, Imperial Britain, Imperial China, and they've been part of that game. So we need to talk to them and bring them into the dialogue.
This notion of the great game, is it still relevant? This is a British term, correct?
It's a British term, John, and in the 19th century you had the rivalry between the great imperial powers, and it was played not through force, not through crude conquest. It was really played by these political agents, by soldiers, scholars who are out there in the field, promoting their own position, but in subtle ways, and through tribal structures, through customs, through traditions, and by knowing the language, by knowing the local culture, and it is very much alive. It's taking a very different form. It's a very, very different form, but it is being played, and you can see it happening.
And there's so many, there's so many different players as well. I mean, you have the Iranians, you've got the Russians, you've got the Afghans, the Pakistanis.
More people at the table
groups,
than in the previous.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
The notion of some of the things Akbar was talking about earlier, about roads and electricity and this investment in infrastructure that can change the game for any group of people on the planet who are living in impoverished areas. Talk to us a bit about the report that the Wilson Center did that you want to speak to as far as aid to Pakistan and where that can be most strategically effective.
Right, yeah, the Wilson Center came out with this report that looks to try to, it basically is humble in the sense that the U.S. aid policies, economic aid policies, are very limited by the fact that the relationship is not going well. The United States lacks the credibility to get things done in Pakistan in that regard. There's the anti-Americanism which gets in the way, and then there's also the bureaucratic issues on both sides. So what we tried to do was come up with some what we thought were reasonable recommendations for how the United States can better do its aid program, its economic aid program in Pakistan. And we actually, one of our conclusions was that we get away from the tribal areas a bit. And we weren't trying to be provocative. Our view there is that there are two issues here. One is that the security situation being what it is, it's very difficult for aid workers, much less U.S. aid workers, to build projects and to monitor projects. Also, the United States is very keen on having what it calls high visibility, high impact projects, large projects, dams, big buildings that Pakistanis will see and have evidence of good deeds that the United States is doing. The problem is, I mean, these are very inaccessible areas, the tribal regions. I mean, if you build something, even if it's there, how are we to know that Pakistanis around the world? Very sparsely populated, yeah. So we argue that there should be more of a focus on essentially redirecting aid projects to urban areas in Pakistan. And again, this is not to take away from the importance of the tribal areas, but we're talking about modest things that can be done given emerging trends in Pakistan. And these include urbanization, which is proceeding very quickly in Pakistan. I think by 2030, half the country is expected to be living in cities. So cities are essentially, you've got on the one hand the growing industries, the pharmaceutical industries, the IT industry. India tends to overshadow it in that regard, but Pakistan's IT industry is really growing quite well. And you have got a lot of people there, you've got a lot of small and medium businesses that comprise about 85% of non-agricultural jobs in Pakistan, which is a huge number, particularly given the urbanization trends. So we argue for doing things like, on the one hand, providing support for energy and sanitation, water programs in urban areas, and also investing in these small and medium businesses, particularly in job skills training. We've got a lot of young people who are ready to work, but there aren't enough job skills programs. So vocational training, things like that, we make a big push for that. We also talk about the need to promote literacy training. So this is a lot more modest than what many folks would want, particularly at USAID. And this is not to take away from the dams and things like that, but we argue that there are a lot of international organizations, donors, that are already doing that type of work. The Asian Development Bank, for example, is very active in the large energy and water projects. So we're trying to think of ways to carve out a niche in a modest way, given the realities of the situation on the ground.
Can this type of approach gain traction?
It will, and it's absolutely needed, as Michael points out, but you'll have noticed immediately it's leaving out Balochistan, the largest province of Pakistan, the frontier province or the tribal areas, where there are major political problems. And there's a problem.
What are the nature, you've referenced it before, what's happening there?
There's an almost simmering kind of civil war situation in Balochistan. Terrible things are happening on both sides, government and the Baloch people, and there are complaints now emerging. Similarly in the tribal areas, so we cannot ignore it. Given the constraints, I would say, Michael, that we need to be focusing on, for me this has always been a passion, and I'm not just speaking as a professor on campus, education. Foreman Christian College is a college where I went to in Lahore. Now, it is still, John, it's never been attacked by the Taliban. They haven't blown it up where they attack other schools elsewhere in Pakistan. It is Foreman Christian College run by Presbyterian teachers from America. It has produced presidents. There were at least two in my time, Musharraf and Laghari. The ministers, members of parliament, a whole generation of scholars and leaders in Pakistan. Why can't we have some of this aid diverted to creating schools, not necessarily calling them Christian college, but calling them some kind of colleges in Balochistan, in the tribal areas, because every local tribesman loves to think of education for his kids. And if we can create them so they're not high profile and yet they're having a huge impact in turning around how people are thinking for the future.
Is there spillover benefit? In other words, if you were to invest in the more urban areas, is there benefit to the tribal region?
Well, I mean, there could be, but I should probably clarify. We're not trying to ignore education. I guess we're trying to small scale educationally, and so what we promote essentially is not necessarily building schools, but though we've done that before. I mean, you mentioned Foreman, and there's also LUMS, Lahore University of Management Sciences, one of the most prestigious.
But again, Michael, that's Lahore. You need things in Balochistan,
right,
and in the frontier province, in the tribal areas.
Right.
Colleges for each one of the agencies. I would like a college like Foreman Christian College in each agency, so that you're producing an entire generation of local tribesmen who I've described to you, now emerging as educated, and they would all love America. We grew up really having the highest respect and affection for our American teachers. I'm talking about the 60s.
Right.
That was a result of our education.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that, but I guess what we try to promote is, instead of building schools, and this would apply anywhere, not just in Punjab or urban areas, but anywhere in the country, but instead subsidizing transportation costs to allow poor families to send their kids, particularly their girls, to schools when they may otherwise not be able to afford to. So things like that. Obviously, we think that educational assistance is vital, particularly in Pakistan, as you said. I mean, it's prized in Pakistan. Everyone, the poorest family, wants their child to get a good education.
So Michael, your next paper has to be on this. Colleges in the tribal areas of Pakistan.
Speaking of the larger relationship beyond any of the specific regions of U.S.-Pakistan relations, we haven't addressed this notion of this trust gap that exists between the countries. And I'm bringing it up with only a couple of minutes left in our discussion, but I'm wondering on both of your thoughts on, is there a way we can begin to close that gap? It seems as if with such a strategic relationship that has so many implications globally, not just within the region, that it's not going to work unless we have a better working relationship. What do we need to do to address that?
I think, John, this relationship is vital for both countries, for the long term, for the short term. The interest of both countries, and both countries, the leadership of both countries have really mismanaged it, because the differences in policy which exist in all relationships seeped into the media and then into the public. So you have Americans now really distrustful of Pakistan. They see Pakistanis as duplicitous, as lying, as, you know, they have all kinds of negative stereotypes, and Pakistanis equally.
And they see aid as a bad investment. In
and
cases.
The Americans in Pakistan, they see them as behind every kind of nefarious activity that's taking place.
Anything.
Anything. So, you know, it's become like almost a joke. Now, that is dangerous, because Pakistanis at this moment are going through a highly emotional period in terms of the law and order, in terms of the crises in the country, and they're responding in an almost irrational anger, just rejecting things. It's dangerous because in that region, with the geopolitics of that region, you really need wise and cool leadership. And wise and cool leadership is not what we're getting. So the leadership of both countries have to be taking a long-term view and back down from this heated rhetoric, and encourage the media to be taking the relationship more seriously than it is. I've heard very big names in America on television calling the entire nation of Pakistan, I won't name the name, but one of them on the Bill Maher show actually said this. He said, Pakistan is a nation of psychopathic liars. Now, when you make statements like this, you're going to get every Pakistani, and there are 180 million of them, extremely upset. So this kind of thing...
Where do you go from there?
Yeah, we need to be sensitive to this.
Got about 30 seconds, Michael, for your thoughts on this.
There are two different levels of trust gaps between the people and between the governments in both countries. And in terms of the people, you know, it gets into cliched territory, but exchanges cannot be overestimated. One of the most moving experiences I've ever been involved with in my professional career was giving a talk to a group of high school students from the tribal areas. You know, some of them had trouble getting visas. Most of them came. Some of them had death threats, but they came here on a USAID-sponsored program. Their teachers were with them. They were both women, and they were great kids. They had nothing against America, and Americans need to see more of that and know that there's more of that out there.
People-to-people diplomacy still has a role.
Right.
And more tools to do it with social media.
Exactly.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John.
A big topic. I think we did it some justice, but it's certainly something, as you've suggested, we need to keep talking about, figure out.
Thank
Thanks.
you, John. Thank you.
We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.